Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Orange and Black Insider. I am Anthony Cosenza. I'm joined by Scott Schultze. This is the number one podcast for Bengals fans, and we are happy that you are joining us. In case you are looking at seeing the video and not just the audio of the show, you might see a little bit of striping going on my face and shoulders and whatnot. Got a little sun peeking through the blinds. Should be going away in a little bit. So if I look a little funky, I apologize. But that's kind of what the stuff we deal with since we don't have a true studio, Scott. But
intentional stripes.
Intentional, yeah. I mean, it goes with the theme of the show and the team and all of that stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's all intentional. How are you, Scott? What's new?
Doing good. I guess it's the longest day of the year, first day of summer. So I am enjoying the wonderful sun by sitting inside and doing a podcast.
Yeah, there you go.
And celebrating the feast days Aloysius of Gonzaga. So yeah, everything's good.
Nice. Have the storms passed your way? We had a little bit of an issue towards the end of the program last week. Has that subsided and everybody's okay on your end, right?
Yeah, 2 weeks ago we had, I think it was 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we had a tornado come through a couple miles from the house. The night we were going to do the podcast, which we ended up pushing back a night. And then, yeah, last week we had some really, really bad thunder, lightning storms come through, knocked out our internet. And as you mentioned, kicked me off at the very end of the show. I wasn't just hanging up. I was actually legitimately kicked off. But yeah, as of right now, everything's bright and sunny, clear blue skies, and it's a typical California day right now. So everything would be really good in Ohio.
Well, there you go. And it has been very nice out my way as well. So yeah, I mean, I can't complain. I don't have some of that stuff that you're dealing with, but that's okay. We do get a little bit of the June gloom out here, if you know what that is. You get kind of the marine layer throughout the day, and then it kind of goes away midday around this time. But anyways, enough about the weather, Scott. Not that I don't want to keep catching up with you, my friend, but we are here to talk some Bengals. And as of now, we're here in late June. The minicamps, rookie minicamps, all that stuff has closed up. And now the team is looking at training camp, which begins, I believe, July 29th, so the very end of July, and then it obviously goes into August when they play the preseason games. Scott, any initial reactions to what you've seen and heard through the minicamp process? I mean, obviously, no news on the injury front is good news. I mean, there was some stuff with Cody Core, but he appears that he'll be fine. Other than that, there really weren't any big injuries, and it sounds like the rookies were playing well. But any additional reactions on your end from minicamp?
I think, at least for me, one of the biggest things was and you don't know how legitimate this is, but the team saying they have a true legitimate kicking battle between the three kickers, because they went and spent a fifth-round pick on the first kicker in the draft, Jake Elliott. So you kind of figure, okay, at that point, he's the kicker. You know, the competition is a veteran who's been below average throughout his career, and then a guy who never even kicked in college, let alone in the NFL. So you kind of figure the job's his, and then everything you see from the Bengals, like, oh no, it's an actual competition. We're tracking them, we're charting them. They're neck and neck. It may be a legitimate competition, but I would be very surprised to see anyone other than Elliott emerge from that. But it was very interesting to hear them say that it was a legitimate battle. So that was something that definitely caught my attention.
Agreed. And obviously the Bengals still, even though they're going with this youth movement, they still seem to like the veteran presence at certain areas, whether they're critical areas, role players, starting spots, what have you. And Randy Bullock is there in the fold and fighting for a job. Jonathan Brown, I believe, is still with the team and fighting for a job, the kicking job there. I would be surprised if Elliott doesn't get the job as well. But this team has shown a penchant to keep veterans over young guys at certain spots, and that might be one of them. We'll see. I love that you brought up a camp battle as some of your reactions. Your initial reactions to the conclusion of minicamp. I agree with you. It's really, for me, and this is going to spin kind of into our next segment here. for me, it's those position battles that I think is going to be – they're going to be very interesting to watch this summer. And now that we're going into training camp, there's a couple of different areas that I think are coming into question, both personnel-wise and coaching ranks obviously is a question. We'll get to that in just a little bit as well. But coaching is a question. Certain position groups are a question. I think everybody's going to have their eyes on the offensive line and how that group performs, specifically when the pads are on and they're playing against other competition in preseason. That's going to be very interesting. I think you mentioned the kicking competition is one that's shaping up to be very interesting. I'm looking at the running back spot though too, Scott. You got Joe Mixon apparently is looking very good in camp, which is great news. And it's quelling the talk of all of the other off-field stuff that happened years ago, which is good. We don't need to rehash that. But he looks apparently very good. Jeremy Hill's still in the mix. Giovanni Bernard is rehabbing. We don't know if he'll be ready at the onset of the regular season. He might be. But that's a position that kind of intrigues me. Do you feel the same, or do you feel that Mixon might be running away with that competition?
At least in this year, I'd be very hard-pressed to see him running away with it because the Bengals have a loyalty to the veterans and to Jeremy Hill. And even if you remember way back in Jeremy Hill's rookie year when he was having that phenomenal second half of the season, and most teams and most fans think, okay, he's kind of taken over, he's the guy. They still split him 50-50 with Giovanni Bernard as far as touches. So I think if Bernard's healthy and if Hill – even if he's not all that effective, I would just be very surprised to see them hand the job to Mixon. I think next year they could, because Hill's probably a free agent who will not be re-signed. And then, of course, you don't know what's going to happen with Bernard as far as their recovery. Everyone's saying, yep, it's great. He's coming back 100%, coming back. And it could be, but you never know between now and opening day if he does have a setback. So as much as I would – and I think we've kind of talked about this, that we're both big fans of Mixon as a player, that it would be great to see him get a lot of touches. That's something I'd be surprised if he got as many as I think we would like to see him get, which kind of leads me to another couple guys I'm very interested in as far as their playing time. Is one of them is Trey Hopkins. He's a guy I've been a fan of for a couple years, looks great in training camp. He seems to play all over the line. He looked good last year at left tackle, looked good in the guard positions. I'd like to see him to get a legitimate shot, and I'm also very interested in probably the star of the OTAs, Carl Lawson, to see what their plan is for him. If they can actually make him a starter, or just make him – I don't know if their plan is just to be a situational pass rusher, or maybe supplant someone like Vinny Ray and actually get playing time and like, hey, this guy is so that good, and he fell to us as a steal. We just have to get him on the field. So I think those are a couple other ones I'm very curious to see how they play out.
Yeah, the other outside, the strong side linebacker spot. I mean, obviously, Will is locked up with Vontaze Burfict. Middle is locked up with Kevin Minter, who was signed this offseason. And Sam, there's talk of Nick Vigil being the quote-unquote starter, but that could mean a number of different things. That could mean he's out there for one down and then comes back in and nickel packages in a different spot. Lawson could be in there on, pass rush situations as the Sam linebacker. So that is a very interesting spot to watch for sure, Scott. What about defensive tackle? To me, that seems to be that's a very crowded position. There's a lot of veteran talent there, a lot of guys who might be on their last chance to make a roster, whether it's Pat Sims, maybe even Brandon Thompson. To get that rotational type of role. I think, barring health issues and whatnot, I think Andrew Billings will probably be that, again, quote-unquote starter out there, first down, maybe second down, maybe off the field down 3, and then they mix in some guys. But big year for Marcus Hardison, big year for Pat Sims, big year for Brandon Thompson. It's pretty early to kind of do a roster prediction, but that's going to be a major battle spot, I think, right?
Yeah, and I think probably the most intriguing one is probably, the guys like Deshaun Williams and the guy in mind just went, Mark, the guy from Arizona State, Hardison.
Yeah.
Because those guys we've seen. I mean, there was a lot of hype with them. They seem to be that poor man's Geno Atkins kind of guy. And the thing is, okay, the glimpses we've seen seem kind of promising. When you see their college film and you see what they've done and the little, clips here and there as far as preseason, but I think it's a make and break year for them because I'd be surprised if they both make the roster, especially with as you mentioned, Billings and I'm sure Atkins are the two guys entrenched ahead of them to see how that shakes out. So it'd be very interesting. I think it's a chance for fans to finally see, hey, okay, we've heard all this talk about these guys. Let's see what they can finally do. And it's probably something where when it's all said and done, I'm sure one of them is going to emerge and we'll probably see, okay, the one guy was just hype, he didn't pan out, and the other one didn't. And the other one, you're like, wow, this guy's, but which one's which? I think that'll be really cool to see which one emerges as that. Kind of like talk about, like baseball, you have the prospects and you have like your top 10 prospects in the minors. And if like a third of them make the majors as good starters, you're like, yeah, that was pretty successful. So you kind of figure, the odds are all these guys we've been hearing about aren't going to be as good as we're hoping, but you figure some will. So, yeah, that's the interesting thing is, okay, which of these guys is finally going to break through? And then someone like Ryan Glasgow, is he going to be able to push Brandon Thompson or Pat Sims? And because you can't have, 8 defensive tackles.
Right. And, the Bengals love those big defensive tackles in those middle rounds, in rounds 3 and 4, and they've struck. We've talked about it on the program before. They've struck gold at that position in a number of different ways. Pico, Pat Sims, Geno Atkins. They drafted Hardison in the 4th. Andrew Billings was a 4th-round pick. Glasgow, you mentioned, was a 4th-round pick. So a lot of mid-round guys that they get a lot out of at the defensive tackle position. So they're going to need to sort a lot of stuff out at that position. Scott, correct me if I'm wrong. When we just talked about the running backs a couple of minutes ago, you had said, I do think you had said that you believe that the team still will have some sort of a veteran presence in terms of carries and touches there, correct?
Yes.
So
their track record.
Yes. So yeah, agreed. I guess that brings me to a point, and it's another position or a spot that I think is going to be, not only do I think it's going to be very important and very interesting to see how it plays out, but it's also almost every week, Scott, whether it's on this show or at Cincy Jungle, we get asked about Alex Erickson and what his status is with the team, because the team added 2, they added John Ross in the top 10 and a 4th rounder in Josh Malone. This year, they re-signed Brandon LaFell, and obviously Erickson was kind of one of those last makes, I guess, because he was primarily a returner. But you have him. You still have Adam Jones on the roster, who was just a couple of years removed from being a Pro Bowl return man. You now have John Ross, who returned kicks effectively in college, and you have Joe Mixon, who returned kicks effectively in college. So that's a spot I'm going to be looking at. I don't know exactly who all will be back there in terms of returning kicks as training camp starts. I would tend to think Erickson has the inside track still, but that would mean the Bengals would likely have to keep 7 wide receivers. Do you see that happening? Do you see Erickson, as much as it may pain some fans and as productive as he was last year, do you see him sticking on the roster at this point, or what are your thoughts?
I guess my personal thought is I think Erickson's probably on the outside looking in as far as he can get a job, but I don't think he's guaranteed a job. Because as you mentioned, a couple of the guys they drafted, plus the kid from Houston who's been hurt all preseason or all off season. So you kind of have the rookie, I guess Mixon also a rookie, Ross the rookie. You have 3 guys who are rookies, and as you mentioned, Adam Jones. And Erickson's basically just a returner. Even when they had the injuries at receiver last year, they still didn't feel comfortable with him enough to really give him a lot of snaps or targets at the receiver position. So I think they're looking at Erickson as just a receiver only. And I think if they can get that from another guy who can fill another role, such as, receiver, backup receiver, backup running back, whatever, and returner, I think that's the route they'd go because that gives them flexibility. Because as we talked about, they have all these other position battles, and you may want to keep the extra defensive tackle. And you look at the draft, a lot of people figured the draft was pretty good. They added a lot of people, so you have a lot of good people. So you added 2 guys who are kind of similar in that they are probably going to start out as pass rushing specialists in Lawson and Willis. Well, you're not cutting them. You're obviously not cutting Ross, not cutting Mixon. The odds of them cutting the defensive tackle from Michigan right after drafting him are pretty low. Elliott's probably making the roster. So you have all these people you've added, and they like their veterans. So I think it'd just be very hard for them to justify keeping a guy who they're only going to use as a returner unless he just has a breakout. If he's far and away the best guy in preseason, I could see it. But if it comes down to him and these other guys, and they're like, yeah, they're kind of close, I think Erickson could be on the outside.
Yeah. We've got a couple of reactions in the YouTube chat. And for those who are listening, not to the live stream, but are downloading the program either on YouTube, iTunes, or SoundCloud, you can join us every week, either in our live YouTube chat. We throw that link out on Twitter, and we also put it up on Cincy Jungle. We are live on Cincy Jungle, streaming there as well. So join us live if you're able every episode. A couple of reactions in the YouTube chat. Garrett Ford says he believes the Bengals will keep 7, as does Zachary Stemple, 7 receivers. AJ Green, Brandon LaFell, Tyler Boyd, John Ross, Cody Core, Josh Malone, and Erickson. From both of those are the guys that they keep 7. Other people, Royal Flush 513, let the young guys play at defensive tackle. Someone else said they think that Sims is expendable at defensive tackle. Here's the thing, Scott. If you're going to go heavy at wide receiver, you got to go light elsewhere. Obviously, we talked about that. Wide receiver is very crowded. Cornerback's pretty crowded. Safety, with the addition of Brandon Wilson this year, is kind of crowded. Defensive line, defensive tackle is crowded. Ironically, to me, it seems as if the Bengals might go light at their weakest position group on paper at this point, which is offensive line. They may have to go light there to keep some of these guys at some of these other crowded positions, because what the Bengals have done on the offensive line is draft low to mid-round players that are versatile and can play multiple spots, so those can free up roster spots. Is that a wise decision if they do that, though?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said their weakest position, that as unknown as they are, you would really hope they would not go light, because you really don't know what you're getting with Boyhe and Fisher. And we're probably not going to know till a month in the season if they are the linemen they draft them to be, or if they're going to look like the guys from the last couple years where you're just kind of thinking, man, this isn't what we wanted. And if that is, if they're struggling, you need to have those guys there on the roster you can plug in. So you would hope, I think they normally carry 8. So I don't think you'd want to go any lower than 8. And some of the other positions, they're going to keep at least 4 running backs because they love Cedric Pierman. They're not getting rid of Hill Bernard or Mixon. And they look quarterback. Well, are they going to keep Driscoll on the roster again? I mean, granted, it's only 1 spot, but I can't imagine them keeping 3 quarterbacks for a second straight year. That would be kind of an odd decision on their part. I don't know if they would possibly go short on linebacker. I know they generally try to keep the same number on offense and defense. So I guess if they did add the extra receiver, I don't know if they would do that at the expense of a tight end. If someone because I don't think Hewitt would be gone. I don't think Uzama would be gone. I don't know if Croft would be expendable this soon into his career. He seems to have fallen out of favor, and they say things about him, but he just doesn't get the playing time to justify some of the comments they make about him. So yeah, it just kind of makes you wonder if they kept that many, where it would come from, and unless they make a surprise cut that no one's seeing.
Yeah, they're going to have to get creative, and fortunately and unfortunately, this team is going. The names you're going to see released over through the summer are going to be names that are probably either have been productive players for the Bengals, could be productive players for the Bengals, or had that high potential and maybe just couldn't stay healthy, that sort of thing. And that's kind of just what it is. We've got some other comments in the. But by the way, Greg L in the chat room earlier asked us a question that he wanted as a listener question. We're going to try and get to those at the end of the show, so leave those in the YouTube chat or at Cincy Jungle. Greg L asked a question if we think that the Bengals will let Jeremy Hill walk. I'm not sure if that meant cut him this year or if that meant let him walk in free agency next year. I think we're both in agreement, Scott, that this year Jeremy Hill will be on the Bengals. He's in the last year of a very affordable contract, and I think he's here to stay unless you have some differing opinions on that. Now he may not get the carries he once did, but I think he's here. Let's see what else in the YouTube chat. I saw one earlier. Can't seem to find it at the moment. But at any rate, keep those comments coming. Keep the conversation flowing there in the YouTube chat and on Cincy Jungle. We appreciate it. And you can get this program if you are not watching it live. You can get this program on SoundCloud, on YouTube, on iTunes. The video, the audio, all of that is available in those platforms. We're also on cincyjungle.com. So if you listen to this program but you don't visit that site, do so to not only get this program but all of the nice, great content that site puts out on the Bengals regularly. And then you can get in contact with the show via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, or on Twitter @BengalsOBI. Ask some questions, give us feedback. We'd love to hear from you. This is a listener-driven show, and we are so stoked that you guys join us live every week, ask your questions, all of that. So we love to hear from you. Scott, we've talked quite a bit about the running back position. You are kind of our resident fantasy football guy on this program, and there's been a lot of now fantasy football drafts won't be taking place for probably a couple of months, obviously. But minicamps just ended. John Ross, I believe, did not practice in those sessions. He's still kind of recovering from some stuff. Obviously, we talked about Joe Mixon being looking very good in practices. But when you come to fantasy football options, and people that listen to the show might be looking at some options, some Bengals players' options in their fantasy football drafts. Is John Ross or is Joe Mixon a better fantasy football option for people out there? Now, I think on paper, running backs tend to bring a bit more value, especially those that can catch the football. You look at both. There's pluses and minuses for both. I think Mixon maybe has, on paper, at least when you first ask the question, has a little bit more of a leg up. But, John Ross has that big playability and should be ready to go at the onset of the season. And, he might be asked to do just a couple of things, but they could be plays that create big touchdowns, that sort of thing. So from a fantasy football perspective, as we sit here in late June, who is the better fantasy football option if a team owner has to come and make the decision between one of those two guys?
Well, part of my answer, I'm actually going to reserve judgment until the end of August, but I'm going to give my reason why. If you look at the Bengals' number 2 receiver, so basically the guy behind A.J. Green, the last 4 years, he's whoever that's been, Sanu, Jones, whoever, has pretty consistently averaged 60 catches, 800 yards, and 6 touchdowns per season. That's pretty decent production. That's a decent number 3 receiver on your fantasy team. So if Ross is going to be the number 2, I would be happy with him because that's a decent receiver who's going to start some weeks. If Ross does not become the number 2, if he's no better than number 3, the production historically for the Bengals drops off dramatically. The number 3 receiver, the last 4 seasons or so, is averaging under 40 catches, 400 yards, and 1 touchdown. So you have to look at Ross, and you see LaFell, who's probably in front of him, Tyler Boyd, who's probably in front of him, So he could be as number 4, and he's got to pass both those guys to become number 2. So I'm going to say right now in June, on June 21st, on the first day of summer, I'm going to say Ross is probably not going to put up the production of the Bengals number 2, but probably closer to number 3, if even that. And if that's the case, 400 yards and 1 touchdown really isn't draftable in most fantasy leagues, unless if you're doing dynasty or but doing like a regular redraft 12-team league, whether it's PPR or not, that's just not a draftable stat line you want from a guy. Mixon, on the other hand, as we mentioned earlier, is kind of an unknown in the same way because he's probably going to, if all things being equal, if they still give Hill the short yardage and the goal line starting the year, and if Bernard comes back as healthy as they're saying he is, they're probably a 3-headed monster, and as horrible as a 2-headed monster is, a 3-headed is even worse. Although the one thing we have seen from Carolina, who has run with 3 running backs including Newton. So Newton, Williams, and Stewart for a while, and then after Williams, it's been they all seem to be able to get their numbers, so to speak. And with the lack of great running backs, because a lot of teams just aren't using the high volume workhorses anymore. And I'm inclined to go with Mixon right now. And part of the reason too with that is you figure there's a lot of ifs for Mixon to only be in a 3-headed system. You have to assume that they keep feeding the ball to a Hill who may not be effective, and you have to assume Bernard has no setbacks and Bernard is as healthy as they're saying he is. Either of those could change. If they change, that's only better for Mixon. So I'm going to say, all signs as of right now probably point to Mixon getting pretty good volume. And one thing that I think I don't know how many people are kind of considering this, is that he catches the ball very well. Some people consider him the best receiving running back in the draft, even ahead of a guy like Christian McCaffrey, who is known as a good receiver. So that's a lot of extra production there. And especially if Bernard goes down, he kind of gives you what Bernard has in the elusiveness in the receiving, but he can also give you what Hill has because he's 228 pounds. He gets a guy that can run between the tackles. That wasn't his specialty in college, but it's something he can do. So, his upside is definitely very up. And I'd say he has a higher floor and a higher ceiling than Ross, at least in this first year. So between the two of them, if all things being equal, if I'm using the same pick, like a mid-late round pick, I would lean towards Mixon as of today. Now, 3 months I may have a different answer, but right now I'm going Mixon.
Yeah, and I think most people would. The one thing, the thing that makes it tricky, though, the Bengals, when he's healthy, the Bengals will use Giovanni Bernard in passing situations, which could cut some of those catches that Mixon could get as a rookie. And as Zachary Stemple pointed out in our YouTube chat, he expects Hill to get an extension because he's a solid red zone scorer. So, if you remember, Scott, back in the late 90s, in the wonderful era of Bengals football that was ensuing at that point, the Bengals had Kajana Carter, who had a plethora of injuries, but they still, they were still sticking with him, but they also added Garrison Hurst. And what they did for a long time, I believe it was a year or 2 years, but what they did in most of the games is they gave the ball to Hurst basically essentially between the 20s, the 20-yard lines. And he would get them very close to the goal line, and Kajana Carter would then punch it in from there. That might be something that happens this year with Mixon and Jeremy Hill. Jeremy Hill has had some issues, had a great rookie season, has had some issues since, but has a nose for the end zone. He has scored a lot of touchdowns, and that also can cut into Mixon's production. Do you still see Jeremy Hill being that goal line guy, especially early on, or do you think Mixon's going to just run away with this competition?
I'd say early in the year, they're probably going to give it to Mixon because, as Marvin Lewis mentioned last year at his press conference, he's kind of afraid of rookies. One of his famous lines from late in the year where he doesn't trust rookies, so he won't give them playing time, but he doesn't give them playing time because he doesn't trust them, but he doesn't trust them because it's kind of one of those circles where they can't get on the field because he's scared of they might fail, and he's scared they might fail because they don't have experience, and don't have experience because they don't. Anyway, long story short, I think Hill's going to be the guy to begin the year in that regard. as far as an extension, one interesting thing, if you look at the Bengals historically, they're very good about having two guys for a similar position. They'll extend one, and then the other one they always let go. So, for example, you look at safety. They extended Georgia Loca. They let Reggie Nelson walk. Guard, they signed Clint Bowling. They let Kevin Zeitler walk. And there's several other examples, like defensive end. They tried to sign Michael Johnson, was it 5 years ago? He didn't take it. They franchised him. They gave that contract to Carlos Dunlap. They let Johnson walk. And then, of course, he came back a year later. So that being said, they extended Giovanni Bernard, which seems to imply that, as a result, they would let Hill walk. And then you look at what they did. They just drafted his replacement in Mixon. So it would seem, I think, going forward beyond 2017, it's probably Mixon's job to lose. But I think this year they probably are going to try to find some way to get all three of them in there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, again, that's one of those position groups. We talked about it in the earlier segments. One of those position groups that's very crowded, and there might not be a surprising cut. There probably won't be a surprising cut in the running back position, but what you might see in terms of roles might be vastly different in amount of touches and all of that sort of thing than what we've seen in the past couple of years. But for now, I think we're in agreement. Mixon is probably a little bit of the safer bet as a higher fantasy pick than John Ross, but don't underestimate John Ross's ability to stretch the field, even take a screen pass a long way. And if he's a guy that might be, maybe he didn't get drafted, maybe the Bengals aren't using him a bunch earlier in the year, and you need a guy to come in, fill a bye week spot, he might be a very good, very explosive option for you to add as a waiver wire claim. I think that's going to be, as it is with a lot of rookies, I think he's going to be a guy that gets better as the year goes on, has more big plays as the year goes on. As we saw from Tyler Boyd as well, he made quite a few plays down the stretch and was pretty sure-handed down the stretch as a rookie. So, I think it's okay to expect some big things from both of those guys. It's just a matter of the fact that there are other talented players in their position groups, and some are slated ahead of them on the depth chart.
Scott,
I think
you mentioned,
go ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned Boyd as far as a fantasy option. I think the challenge with him is going to be he's probably going to be one of these guys who gets you, 10 yards, 20 yards, 80 yards, and a touchdown next week.
Right.
10. And so you've got to get, those 2 or 3 weeks he has those big games. If you can nail those right, then
exactly.
You have this fantasy thing down.
Yeah, he'll get you two and a half points one week and 17 points the next,
Yeah, he's going to be a very feast or famine guy, and you've got to be able to nail those, 2-3 weeks that he really explodes.
Yeah, absolutely. Scott, there's been a series of posts on Cincy Jungle, and it's by Braden. I don't know if it's Whited or Witted. So, Braden, if you listen to the program, I apologize if I butchered your last name. But he has come up with something called Rate Your Hate, fan rate your hate as a Bengals fan. And he goes through each division in the NFL and talks about each team in the division, gives a little bit of, for some teams that there's a historical connection between the Bengals and a certain team. He gives that, if it's based on fan base, if it's based on, jealousy in terms of success of a particular franchise, he notes that. And then there's a poll option where you can vote as a Bengals fan, the most disliked team in a specific division in each respective division in the NFL. Now, obviously, it's no surprise that the Pittsburgh Steelers were the most hated, and obviously, there's a lot of history between the Bengals and their fans, Steelers fans. I want to take Braden's series and put our own little twist on it within the AFC North. And it's not so much, do you dislike the Steelers more than the Ravens or the Ravens? I want to ask you, Scott, what about the division and their teams irks you the most? And what do you hate the most, either about each team or overall in the division? Is it the mouthiness of the Steelers fans? Is it the terrible towel? Is it the chanting that comes from Baltimore fans every first down and any kind of big play that happens from a Ravens player? Is it the large human beings that wear the plastic dog masks in Cleveland, and the same fans that throw beers on Bengals players as they jump into the stands? What are your most hated aspects of the teams in the AFC North? Because this division is very heated. These fan bases are very, very loyal. They do not like each other. The teams don't like each other. I think this is good. There's a lot of things to dislike about a lot of facets to dislike about the teams in the division.
Now, since we only have 2 out of 3 hosts here, I'm going to go ahead and do 2 out of 3 teams. So I'm going to start with the Steelers because that's kind of like shooting fish in a barrel. I'd say one of the things I dislike most about them is they seem to get away with too much. I mean, there's certain players. I can't say I hate the whole entire organization or franchise. I mean, there's obviously good people and good players on the team, but there are certain ones that just drive you crazy. The fact, how Tomlin walks on the field to stop that kick return against the Ravens, and really doesn't get any penalty for that. Shazier, the hit, the leading with the helmet, knocking out Giovanni Bernard that led to a turnover that was one that turnover was people forget about it, but that was one of the key plays that led the Bengals losing that playoff game. It was, Kimo von Oelhoffen, diving at Carson Palmer's knees when the play was over. The Andy Dalton injuring him, obviously, that looked incidental, but still it was something that, took him out of the game. It's, Mike Mitchell headhunting and not really getting any repercussions from it. Hines Ward, targeting a punter with his helmet and not really. I mean, it's, the things like that where they don't really get the penalties or repercussions where the NFL is like, oh, that's fine. We'll let that slide. Where, if Vontaze Burfict or a Bengal were to do that same stuff, they would get, the book thrown at them. They would get, the media would be going after them. The NFL, the fines would be coming after them. The Steelers would do this thing. It's like, oh, that's okay. So that's one thing that drives me absolutely crazy about the Steelers. If I pick one of many, the Browns, the one thing I dislike, it's hard to hate a dumpster fire, so I can't really say I hate the Browns. Maybe if they were good like they were 20 years ago. But the one thing that kind of irks me about the Browns is they just have this penchant for poaching Bengals players. Frosty Rucker was developing as a backup, situational defensive end. They signed him away. Andrew Hawkins was this cool kind of, pinball shifty video game running back. We kind of scooped up as our third, our slot guy. They go and grab him. Eric Steinbach was probably the best interior lineman the Bengals have drafted in decades. I think he was in that Carson Palmer draft. He was really good. They go and take him. Kevin Zeitler, the next time the Bengals draft a guard high, Zeitler turned out to be pretty good. They go and take him. They just have this uncanny ability of looking at, okay, who is a Bengals guy that's doing good, and we'll just go and take him. So I'd say those are the things that irk me the most about those two teams, just kind of off the top of my head.
I agree. And unfortunately, just because of the animosity that Bengals fans have experienced with the Steelers and the Bengals players as well with the Steelers over really in the entire Marvin Lewis era in Cincinnati football, it's hard to really point out. Like, Cleveland has been largely not that great. The Bengals have taken care of business quite frequently with the Ravens, not only in the Andy Dalton era in the last couple of years, but also through the Carson Palmer era. The Bengals got a lot of key wins against them as well. Scott, just so you know, there are a couple of people that in the chat room that agree with you on some of your sentiments with the Steelers. Obviously, they're talking about that playoff game. Kentucky Ron says he calls them Pittsburgh, could commit murder on the gridiron and get no penalty. Obviously, talking about knocking out Gio, Royal Flush 513. Yeah, that hit on Bernard was a clear 15-yard penalty. So, and then he continues, it was the same hit that cost him the game, but the refs didn't call Pittsburgh for it. Or the hair pull by the coaches of Pittsburgh, which was on Reggie Nelson. So there is a lot to dislike about the Steelers. My thing, if I'm going to go team by team, I would say the culture that comes with the Steelers. And I guess that's kind of a cop-out because that's a bit broad, but I'm talking about the fan base, the fact that I remember I went to a Monday Night Football game 2 years ago, I believe it was, and it was a San Diego Chargers Pittsburgh Steelers game in San Diego. I went to this game just randomly, had a free ticket, went to the game, and had a great time. If you remember, this was a Monday night game. The Steelers had Michael Vick as their quarterback. I believe Ben Roethlisberger was hurt, and this was the game where Le'Veon Bell ran it in at the last second to win the game. My point is, and granted, San Diego fans at the point were very jaded because the team was maybe moving, maybe not moving at that point, but I would say there was about 75 to 80% Steelers fans there. And anytime you travel to a stadium that is not Heinz Field, you will find a influx of fans, and not just fans that are, hey, how's it going? They are largely obnoxious, and they have the terrible towels. And to me, terrible is a very apropos adjective for that thing, because I think it's very stupid and I don't like it. So I think just the entire culture, the fan culture, there tend to be, if you go on comment boards, Twitter, all that, Pittsburgh tends to have fans that are quite a bit of the troll-like nature and aren't that much fun to deal with, especially when the team is successful and especially during a football season. For Cleveland and Baltimore, I'm going to kind of use a guy, Art Modell. Art Modell was a guy that, he was a big figurehead in NFL history. He's a guy who fired Paul Brown from his own team, the Cleveland Browns. He's a guy who moved the Browns to Baltimore. Just not a likable guy. Treated some people well, didn't treat others well. And for that, the culture that he created both in Cleveland and in Baltimore, that's a guy, when I think of those teams, I think of him, and I hate to single out one guy, but just not a likable guy. Obviously, the Brown family, especially with the Cleveland Browns, the Brown family that now controls the Bengals, has a lot of animosity to Cleveland, and rightfully so. So many memories with Baltimore. I don't really know where to go specifically with Baltimore, to be honest with you. There's just a lot of stuff that comes to mind. That chanting, so many times where the Bengals seem to have a game sewn up, and the Ravens come up with a miraculous play, whether it's an Ed Reed pick six or Steve Smith coming down with a big catch, whatever it is. Just not my thing. And the Browns, it's tough to say that, but like I said, I'm going to go with Art Modell there. But I don't know, Scott, any additional thoughts on that?
I think I pretty much agree with the things you were saying. I will mention I was in Baltimore last week, and I liked the city. We drove by the stadium. It wasn't bad. They have a great train museum. If you're into trains, I definitely recommend doing that. I went can't say I have anything positive about the team, but they do have a great train museum. So if you happen to go for a Bengals game, make sure you check out the B&O train museum.
And obviously, Baltimore's teams were largely known for their, especially in the 90s and into the 2000s, their nasty defense. There are so many things to dislike about all these teams. It's hard to kind of narrow it down to one thing. But, and the thing is with the Ravens is, they've only been around since 97. So, the history between the Bengals and the Ravens isn't as deep as some of these other. And heck, it isn't even as deep, Scott. You and I know the old AFC Central days, the Oilers / Titans. Those were crazy games.
Weish kind of rivalry with Lewis doesn't seem to have that with anybody.
Oh man, the head coaches at the time in the division, if you remember, it was Sam Weish, who longtime Bengals fans know was not only a great coach but just a huge personality. You had Jerry Glanville at the Oilers, who was literally a cartoon character. I mean, he would leave tickets at the front desks for Elvis and James Dean, and I mean he was a character. You had Chuck Noll with the Steelers, who obviously had a lot of success, and Marty Schottenheimer and others with Cleveland. So obviously a lot of big names at that point, a lot of successful teams in the 80s and 90s with those teams. But at any rate, those are some of the things we hate about the AFC North division teams. Thanks to Braden for giving us a little fuel to this segment and letting us vent. I'll scan some other stuff in the YouTube chat. Greg L calls Steeler fans front runners. Garrett Ford says, I don't hate Cleveland, only Pittsburgh. That's interesting. And others say Pittsburgh fans, Mike Tomlin, all kinds of stuff. Obviously, we knew at least I did, doing this type of segment, talking about what you hate about the AFC North. It's going to be about the Steelers. And unfortunately, we've opened up old wounds, Scott, whether it's the Chemo Von Oelhoffen stuff or Jeremy Hill's fumble or whatever. We've opened up some old wounds. Hopefully you can put those Band-Aids back on and heal them up, Bengals fans. But hopefully we can.
Apparently I'm good at that.
Yeah, well, it's okay.
Last Denver game.
And hopefully we can fuel some of our listeners' hate, and hopefully the Bengals come out and have another competitive season this year and take it to some of these teams that we talked about. Once again, if you are not joining us live, you can listen to the show. You can download it on SoundCloud, on iTunes, and on YouTube. The videos on YouTube. You can also get all of the content on cincyjungle.com. So check out our stuff and others from different contributors. We appreciate that. And you can get in touch with the show, theobinsider@gmail.com via email, and at BengalsOBI on Twitter. And thanks for the feedback. Scott, we're gonna get out of here in just a little bit. But before we do, we got to get to some of our trademark listener questions, and we thank you. We've already got some in the YouTube chat. We did get one via email this week that I wanted to get to, Scott, and it's from John Telly. I think it's very interesting, and there's a couple of questions with this one, so we'll try and kind of hammer it down a little bit, but he asks, John Telly asks, how much responsibility for last year's disappointing season is on the coordinators, meaning Paul Guenther and Ken Zampese? Can they match their highly effective and popular predecessors? Do they have their jobs because the Bengals are too quick to promote from within? If the Bengals suffer another losing season, should the team be looking for new coordinators, even if Lewis is given another contract? And he kind of ends it with saying, basically, are these two guys, Zampese and Guenther, any good? Scott?
I'd say my answer on that is I'm going to say I think Gunther's the real deal. I think like most fans, I was disappointed to see Zimmer leave. I know a lot of fans have for a while had been saying, we want to move Lewis up in the front office or something so that Vance Joseph, Mike Zimmer, one of these guys becomes an ex-head coach, when that didn't happen because Zimmer went to Minnesota. A lot of fans seemed kind of disappointed by that. I would admit, I was kind of hoping. I wasn't sure what to expect from Guenther. Interestingly, the defenses have actually been better under Guenther, which is pretty impressive because it's not like they added a ton more to the roster. if anything, the last couple of years they've lost some of the key guys, and yet they still seem to be cranking it out on defense. So as far as he goes, I think he's pretty good. That takes me to offense. Last year, I get it, was St. Pete's very first year, and it looked like it, especially early in the season. The offense looked out of sync. It looked very predictable. They didn't seem to have any sort of flow or rhythm. It was very disconcerting at times. It seemed like there was just a lot of they just seemed to struggle, and it seemed to be one of these things where you had good players, but there was just something going on that just was keeping them from executing a good game plan and a good strategy and all that stuff that you expect from a coordinator. That being said, I don't know how much it was him, because if you look at what happened 2 years before that, the first year they had Hugh Jackson, Dalton had a horrendous year. He went from a great year in Gruden's last year, and then you go to his first year with Hugh Jackson. He was just, something like, 19 touchdowns, 17 receptions, or whatever it was. It was pretty bad. Yeah. Then in Jackson's second year, before he got hurt, Dalton was in considerations for MVP. So the hope is, okay, how much of this is, is he just really that bad, or is it just we have a new guy, it's going to take a year to kind of get the bugs out? This year we'll see the offense, everyone's had a year in the offense, Dalton's had a year in the offense, it'll really explode. So I can't really place judgment on Zampese yet until we see how the offense plays this year. I will say the first part of last year, I was ready to get rid of him. It just looked ugly at times. But historically, they seem to struggle the first year. They did the same thing with John Gruden his first year. They weren't nearly as good as they were the next couple of years. So I'm hoping it's just a transitional thing, but I guess only time will tell on that.
I tend to agree with you on Gunther. There are times where I don't see the same, I guess, accountability, fire from his players that you saw under Zimmer. And one thing, while Zimmer, you mentioned Gunther's units may have actually outperformed some of Zimmer's units in certain aspects. One thing that Zimmer's unit knew how to do under him was get after the quarterback consistently get after the quarterback. And it was guys like you mentioned, Frosty Rucker, Damata Pecco, Michael Johnson, the guys, they just find ways to get after the quarterback. And after, if you remember, there was a big win the Bengals had, I believe it was 2013 against the Patriots, where they won 13-7 in some bad weather, and it was all because all they did was pressure Tom Brady, and that's the only way you're going to beat the Patriots is if you can continually hit him, continually sack him, and knock the ball down at the line, which is all that the Bengals did under Zimmer in that game. They did the same against Aaron Rodgers, and there's been a little bit less consistency under Gunther in that respect. But I do think Gunther has a lot of the traits that Zimmer has in terms of mixing guys in and all of that, getting guys in certain spots to make plays. So from that standpoint, I think Gunther is a good defensive coordinator. He has got me some head coaching looks. How serious those have been, I don't know, but he's had interviews, that sort of thing. So obviously teams around the league think somewhat highly of him. Zampese is a different story for me. He is a guy that had never been an NFL offensive coordinator and had been the team's quarterback coach for years. Now, granted, he oversaw the great development of Carson Palmer, oversaw the development of Andy Dalton that you mentioned it as recent as 2015 was in the MVP discussion. So he has a lot of good points on his resume, but last year, part of me last year thinks he didn't get a fair shake. And I say that because he lost Marvin Jones, he lost Mohamed Sanu, AJ Green went down with an injury, Giovanni Bernard went down with an injury, Tyler Eifert was gone the first half of the year. So, I mean, part of me thinks he didn't get a fair shake. Part of me also thinks that there was a very stale, predictable, and a lot of short yardage stuff that wasn't going to necessarily equate to big yards after the catch type of plays that were called. The running game was stale. The offensive line and the protection schemes, when they didn't lose any players at that point up front, was, well, I take that back. They lost one on right tackle, but the rest of the team was still faltering. The rest of the line was still faltering in terms of pass protection as well, which worried me. Now he loses Andrew Whitworth. He loses Kevin Zeitler. So I worry about that. I do think it's a big year in year 2 for Zampese, though, Scott, like you said, because he now has all these new toys. He's got Joe Mixon. He's got John Ross. Tyler Boyd's in his second year. Brandon LaFell is in his second year in this system. So he's got a lot of guys. He's got Josh Malone. He can get creative. He can mix things up. It's just a matter of if he is this a job that's over his head? Is this a job that he is not qualified for? I don't know. And like you said, I don't think we'll know the answer until at least a handful of games into the season when we see all of these guys out there. And if this offense is one-dimensional, if they still can't protect the passer, if they still can't run the ball with consistency, then at some point you got to look at the coach and say what's going on here. And it's a big year for this staff because Marvin Lewis is in the last year of his contract. Like I said, Gunther has gotten some sniffs as a head coach elsewhere. And now we're talking about Zampese in that critical second year as an offensive coordinator. But I largely agree with you, Scott. Good question from John Telly. We did get something in the YouTube chat from frequent listener Nick Marks, Scott. We usually do this as its own segment, but we missed it this week, and we missed this one this week. And now I think it's a good question for this week. He wrote the Pro Football Focus, who, by the way, if you follow them on Twitter, have been putting out a number of different positive things about Bengals players, whether it's John Ross and the passer rating of quarterbacks that were throwing his way in college, Tyler Eifert's effectiveness, Vontez Burfict's effectiveness, a lot of different positive stuff in terms of their high ratings of it. However, and I haven't seen this, but I'm tending to believe Nick Marks. Pro Football Focus says that basically, essentially, the Colts, the Bills, and the Dolphins all look better than the Bengals at this point. For me, Scott, Miami might be a little bit of a cherry pick there because they made the postseason last year. The Colts, they have Andrew Luck. I mean, that's the argument, right? And then the Bills, well, I don't know. So of those three teams that Pro Football Focus referenced, that are supposedly better than the Bengals, do you buy that?
I can't say I really buy it with any of them. I mean, I know the Colts are – I mean, obviously they have Andrew Luck, and it's a quarterback-driven league. I mean, we've seen for, a decade now, the Packers continually pump out horrible drafts and subpar free agency periods, but they continue to make the playoffs because they have Aaron Rodgers. And kind of the same thing with the Colts. They are historically bad drafters, reaching for guys and not really seeming to do a good job on that regard. But they always had Peyton Manning, and now they have Andrew Luck. So in theory, it really shouldn't matter. That being said, I think the Colts have enough pieces missing that I don't think Luck can carry them like a Peyton Manning or someone can. So on that one, I don't really see it. Miami, I mean, that's a team we beat, didn't we, last year?
Yep.
And same with pretty convincing. Other than that one long bomb, I mean, the Bengals pretty much, owned that game from beginning to end. And, that was a down Bengals team, and that was a, Dolphins team that made the playoffs. So a good Dolphins team and a bad Bengals team, and we still beat them. So can't say I'm really buying on that one. And then third one, Buffalo, I guess I'm not really buying it. As I said earlier, it's a quarterback league. I know Tyrod Taylor, I guess reviews are kind of mixed on him. He's not necessarily a passer. If you look at his passing numbers, it's very rare that he throws the ball more than 20-some times a game. And when he does, it's usually because they're getting beat. He's not a guy who's going to go up there, win a game for you passing the ball. He's a good system guy that can run for you, can scramble. If the defense is playing well, if the running game is playing well, he can game manage fairly well for you. That being said, of the three, I'd probably say Buffalo is the top of the three if I was just to throw out a team, but I'd put the Bengals ahead of all of them. But I don't work for Pro Football Focus, so I can't say.
Right. And if our sometimes co-host Connor Howe were here, he would he's hot and cold on Pro Football Focus, as am I. I believe that there's a lot to read into with metrics, and obviously there is a lot of merit to what that provides. But I do think the eye test provides a lot of stuff, and there are intangibles that metrics simply can't measure, especially in a game of emotion like football. So I don't wholeheartedly believe everything the Pro Football Focus puts out there, even though former Bengal great Chris Collinsworth is a majority owner of the site. But, you look at the Bills especially, they re-signed a lot of guys, but they also lost quite a few guys. They lost their kicker. There's a cornerback, Nikel Roby-Coleman, who's made some plays for them in the past. They lost Mike Gillislee, the running back, to New England. So, they've lost a lot of guys, and they've also undergone a lot of different personnel changes, general manager, head coach. So they're in the midst of a lot of change. Now, I think there is talent there, and the Bengals, a couple of weeks ago when Rebecca Toback was on the show, Scott, I noted my frustration with the fact that Buffalo was on the Bengals schedule yet again this year, because they always seem to play the Bengals tough, and it's just one of those games on the schedule where you just get exasperated that they're on the schedule. But I look at it and I say the Bengals are probably on paper better than the Bills. I think as a team all around, they're better than Indianapolis. I do think the Dolphins have a lot of talent on their team, but that's a team also who has gone to the playoffs in the past, and then they've regressed and not made the playoffs for 4 or 5 years straight. So, I don't know if I'm a big believer in the Dolphins this year. As it stands, just FYI to the listeners out there, the Bengals do have both the Colts and the Bills, of those three teams we're talking about, on their schedule this year. The Colts are in Week 8 at Cincinnati, and the Bills also are in Cincinnati in Week 5. So, those could be two very winnable games for the Bengals. We'll see. But thanks to Nick Marks, it's not only a listener question, but it also fulfills our hater of the week. Scott, do you call that hate though? Is that true hate?
Not to the level that we've seen from some of the folks, but I guess dissing, the disser of the week.
There you go. The diss of the week. I like it. Let's get going here, Scott. We're running a little short on time. Thanks for everybody who sent in their questions. Again, you can send those in every week via email, theobinsider@gmail.com, on Twitter @BengalsOBI. You can also get all of our content and leave comments, questions, all of that stuff on YouTube, on SoundCloud, and on iTunes. We appreciate all the downloads and support you've shown us over the course of the week. And then also, you can also get all of our content on Cincy Jungle, so please do that. Scott, last few weeks, we've kind of been doing a little bit of final thoughts / pop culture. So, before we get out of here and say good evening to everybody, I wanted to ask you, what is a guilty pleasure of yours in terms of either a band, a TV show, or a movie? Are you a chick flick guy? Do you like NSYNC? What's your poison here, Scott, when it comes to guilty pleasure in some of these pop culture areas? And I want to hear from the live listeners too. because I want to read some of these on the air. Some of your guilty pleasures. We're not here to judge because we're going to embarrass ourselves as well, probably. So, Scott, give me a couple guilty pleasures.
I'm going to say if we do TV, I'll start with TV. It's definitely anything sci-fi related. I love streaming through anything sci-fi I can find on Amazon Prime. So I love the Farscape series, who most people have never heard of, the Stargates, all of them, the SG-1, all 10 seasons of SG-1, the 4 seasons of SG Atlantis, and then Stargate Universe, all the new Star Treks, so DS9, Voyager, Next Generation, all that stuff. And then some of the other ones like Firefly and, yeah, pretty much anything that is sci-fi related that has a series of. Now, the one I haven't seen is Babylon 5, which I've gotten a lot of crap from people before for not seeing. But that's the one I haven't. But I've seen pretty much all the other ones, and some I like more than others. But anything in that genre, it's really hard for me to pass up on if there's a season or two worth that I can find on Amazon and just kind of crank through it. So TV-wise, I would say that would be one. So I will pause right there for now, and if we have time, I'll add maybe some more.
Okay. That's not, I don't know if that's a guilty pleasure. That's more just kind of sci-fi geeky. And I mean, I'm a sci-fi geek to a certain extent as well. Probably not to, I mean, I haven't seen the shows that you're talking about, but big Star Wars guy, we talked about that. So I don't know about that. I'll quell my embarrassment for a minute. By the way, Garrett Ford in the YouTube chat does agree with you, Scott. Stargate was bomb. Yes, Scott. Yes. There's some good ones here. Nick Mark says The Weeknd, the singer The Weeknd. I can't feel my face when I'm with you, which has, I believe, a double entendre with that song. Garrett Ford, Legally Blonde, and The Proposal. By the way, The Proposal is actually a pretty funny movie for those, because Ryan Reynolds can take a chick flick and turn it into something that a guy actually likes and laughs at. So The Proposal isn't too bad if you're a gentleman. Legally Blonde, Garrett. Ooh. Greg L says Dawson's Creek. Wow, that's a good one. Zachary Stemple says, as a huge death metal fan, I rock the poop out of Blue October, which I think was that was kind of a, I can't remember the name of that band right now, but I know who he's talking about, because Blue October was originally an 80s song that band covered. He also adds that he likes Bridesmaids as a show, which is pretty funny. It's a pretty funny movie. I'm going to embarrass myself here, Scott. Are you ready for this? Especially after Zach says he likes death metal. I'm going to say a guilty pleasure of mine is the band Sugar Ray. I find their music to be fun. I actually went recently to a concert of theirs, along with a lot of others, 90 nostalgia bands. It was a ton of fun. So bands like Sugar Ray, Third Eye Blind, my old co-host on a previous show, Mickey Mentzer, former Cincy Jungle contributor, Mickey Mentzer, and I were big Third Eye Blind guys. 311, he and I were also both 311 guys. So some of those throwback bro bands from the 90s are some of my guilty pleasures. In terms of a show, I don't have a ton. I will say there is one recent one that my wife got me into. I'm not as into it as she is, but it's a show called Younger, and it's on TV Land. Supposedly some of the people that created it were responsible for shows like Melrose Place and Sex and the City and all that kind of stuff. Absolutely not my favorite show, but definitely one of those things where you're like, oh, okay, yeah, here's another episode, I'll watch it. Oh, here's another episode, I'll watch it. So those are some guilty pleasures of ours. And, this is such a masculine sport, football, all this stuff. It's time to kind of air some dirty laundry of ours, right, Scott?
Yeah, when I was doing sci-fi, I totally forgot to mention Doctor Who I'd put in that category. He's very different than the other ones, but fan of that. One thing I think you meant, I think Blue October is a band. I think you were thinking of Blue Monday.
Blue Monday. Yeah, that's what it was. Yeah.
Yeah. I think he was referring to someone different because Blue Monday was covered by Orgy, who is not a death metal band, but more of a.
They're not death metal. They were kind of like of
techno rock.
Yes, techno rock. Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So maybe that's what he meant. I don't know, but good call on that. Scott, let's get out of here. Anything else you want to add before we sign off, my friend?
I will mention that since we are about the same age, I won't say who's older. I think we both know who's older slightly. I've heard a lot of those bands when they were the bands you listened to when they were still on the radio back when MTV played music videos and the radio still played stuff like that. So I know exactly what you're talking about with Sugar Ray. Although I like Sugar Ray's older stuff more, like Mean Machine, more than the poppy stuff. And the only song I know by 311's Down. But
okay.
I will say one band I really got into some early 2000s, a band that most people have never heard of, which tends to be what makes, I guess, a guilty pleasure because someone knows I've heard of. But I really love a band called The Apologetics. They are very, very, very talented, creative. Basically, Weird Al is a non-Christian version of them. So that'd be a way to describe them. I don't know who actually came out first. They both date to back in the 80s, but they do a lot of modern stuff too. Just very similar thing, but very impressive. Tons of music styles they cover, and they do a very good job. The lyrics are very creative and catchy, just like Weird Al does. So I listen to a lot of Actually, there's a lot of songs I hear on the Apologetics. I'm like, oh, I really like this. I wonder who the original is. Or most people kind of go the other way, like they hear the original and then they hear the cover, and like they grumble about the cover. With them, I usually hear the cover first because that's kind of cool. I wonder if it's like who actually makes this. Then I have to go back and see who the original is.
Yep.
I guess I'll save. Yeah, we can save more for next week and the following week since we have a few weeks and then some until training camp and anything.
Until stuff ramps up. Yeah. So I guess stay tuned, everybody. We're going to embarrass ourselves even more with some more guilty pleasures over the next couple of weeks. But thanks for everything, Scott. Thanks for joining tonight. Thanks to all the listeners who tuned in live. Appreciate it. This has been the Orange and Black Insider, the #1 Bengals fan podcast. We appreciate you listening. We appreciate you downloading. If you're unable to join us live, appreciate you getting the program how you're able. And if you are able to join us live, please do every episode. Follow us, get our content. Go to cincyjungle.com and read the content of ours and other contributors there. We appreciate their support. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time.